Something that happened before is happening now. Not the same event, something structurally similar, emotionally resonant, bearing enough resemblance to the original that the part of you which keeps the record has flagged it and is responding not to the present situation, but to the pattern it shares with the earlier one. The overreaction that everyone else in the room found puzzling. The certainty, in a situation that does not fully warrant it, that you know how this ends. The specific emotional flavor that arrives in certain relationships or certain kinds of circumstances. And that feels so old, so familiar, so unrelated to the specific people and specifics of the present moment that it can only have come from somewhere else. The past is not behind you. This is one of the most important and most counterintuitive truths in all of psychology. The past is the structure through which the present is experienced. The early relational patterns become the template for current relationships. The unresolved emotional experiences become the lens through which ambiguous present situations are interpreted. The stories formed about the self, who you are, what you deserve, what is possible for someone like you, operate in the present as invisible legislation, shaping choices before the conscious mind has had the opportunity to evaluate them. This is not a counsel of despair. The past is not destiny. The patterns can be revised. The unfinished business can be finished. The stories can be examined and where they are inaccurate, corrected. But none of this is possible while the past is running invisibly, under the surface, mistaken for the present. The first step is always the same, seeing clearly what is actually happening, including the historical dimension that the present event is carrying. Part 1. How the past runs the present. The developmental psychologist Daniel Stern described the infant's first year of life as the period during which what he called representations of interactions that have been generalized are formed, rigs, in his shorthand. These are the neural representations of repeated relational experiences that the infant uses to predict how the next interaction will go. The infant who has learned that calling out produces a warm, responsive presence develops a rig that says, "My needs are heard and met." The infant whose calling out is met inconsistently or not at all develops a rig that says, "My needs may not be met, and I must develop strategies for managing that uncertainty." These representations do not disappear when childhood ends. They become, as the attachment researchers describe it, internal working models, the unconscious templates through which all subsequent close relationships are approached, predicted, and interpreted. The person with a secure early relational history approaches new relationships with a default expectation of trustworthiness. The person with an anxious early history approaches new relationships with a default expectation of potential abandonment. The person with an avoidant history approaches new relationships with a default expectation that closeness is risky and self-sufficiency is the safer strategy. These defaults operate before conscious thought. They shape the emotional register in which a new relationship is experienced, the specific kinds of behavior the person is most alert to in the new partner, and the specific interpretations that are applied to ambiguous behavior. The same partner saying, "I need some time alone this evening," is experienced very differently by the secure person, who reads it as a reasonable need for autonomy, and the anxiously attached person, for whom the same statement activates the threat response of impending abandonment. The partner has not changed. The history of the person receiving the statement has. The concept of transference, the redirection toward a present person of feelings that originated in a past relationship, was one of Freud's most important contributions to the understanding of how the past operates in the present. In its original clinical form, it described the way patients redirected feeling toward the therapist that had originated in relation to the parents. In its broader form, it describes the universal human tendency to see the present through the lens of the significant past relationships, to find in the present colleague the critical parent, in the present partner the unavailable one, in the present friend the unreliable one. The present person may have none of these qualities. The history produces the perception. The Gestalt therapy tradition introduced the concept of unfinished business, the incomplete emotional experiences, the unresolved conflicts, the unexpressed feelings that continue to demand completion, and that, in the absence of the direct opportunity to complete them, press for expression through whatever analogous present situation presents itself. The person who never expressed their grief at a particular loss will find that grief activated and seeking expression in situations that, to a neutral observer, seem only marginally related to the original loss. The person who never expressed their anger at a specific injustice will find that anger mobilized in the present by situations that share the injustice's emotional signature. The unfinished business is not pathological. It is the mind's persistence in the service of completion, its refusal to simply abandon the unresolved experience because completion has not yet occurred. The completion is what the present-day expression is seeking. And the person who can recognize the historical dimension of a present-day emotional response, who can ask not only what is happening now, but what this is similar to from before, is in a position to direct the completion toward the actual origin, rather than attempting to resolve the old business through the inadequate proxy of the present situation. Part 2. The unfinished CONVRSATONS. Among the most powerful forms of unfinished business are the unfinished conversations, the ones that ended without the central thing being said, the ones that were foreclosed by death, by departure, by the relationships ending before the important truth had found its way into the exchange, the ones that were never started because the starting felt too dangerous, and that now live in the interior as a permanent item of emotional inventory, something that needs to be addressed but has no available address. The empty chair technique, developed within the Gestalt therapy tradition, is one of the most documented and most consistently effective interventions for unfinished conversations with people who are absent or unavailable. The person imagines the absent other in the empty chair across from them and speaks the words that were never spoken, the love not expressed, the anger not addressed, the grief not shared, the truth not told. The other person's absence does not, it turns out, prevent the completion from occurring. The completion is an internal process. The words are for the self, primarily the self that has been carrying the unspoken thing and needs the experience of it being finally expressed. Research on expressive writing, the therapeutic practice of writing about emotionally significant experiences that has been studied by James Pennebaker and many subsequent researchers, consistently shows that the act of expressing significant emotional content in words, even to no one, produces measurable physiological and psychological benefits. The cortisol reduction, the immune system improvement, the mood enhancement, the reduction in intrusive thoughts about the unresolved material, all of these occur through the act of expression itself, independent of whether the expression reaches the person it was intended for. The philosopher Jacques Derrida wrote extensively about what he called the impossible mourning, the specific grief of the relationship that ended without the completion it deserved, the death that came before the reconciliation, the estrangement that was never resolved, the person who left with things between you still open. He argued that these incomplete relationships do not simply end. They persist in the interior life of the person who is still alive, still carrying the unfinished business. The work of impossible mourning is not the resolution of the unresolvable, but the honest engagement with what remains, the acknowledgement of what was incomplete, the expression of what was unsaid, the grief for the completion that will not occur through the means originally intended. Writing the unsent letter is among the most accessible of the unfinished business practices, not as a step toward actually sending, though sometimes, after the writing, the decision to send becomes clear, as the expression of what has been waiting for expression, the full, honest, unedited communication of what was never communicated, the love, the anger, the hurt, the gratitude, the things you needed them to know and never found the words for, or found the words and withheld them. The writing itself is the completion. The physiological response it often produces, the tears, the relief, the specific quality of release that follows the expression of something long held, is the body's confirmation that something genuinely unfinished has been moved toward completion. The unfinished conversations are not only with other people, they are also with past versions of yourself. The younger self who made choices you have been judging ever since without ever completing the genuine accounting of what those choices cost and what they meant in the context in which they were made. The version of you who was hurt and was never fully witnessed in that hurt. The version of you who needed something and did not receive it and has been carrying the unmet need into every subsequent situation that resembled the original one. The conversation with that younger self, the genuine acknowledgement of what they experienced, the genuine compassion for what they carried, the genuine completion of the witnessing they always needed, is among the most powerful of all the unfinished business practices available. Part 3. Repetition. Why we keep arriving at the same place. There is a phenomenon that every therapist who has worked for more than a few years will recognize with the specific combination of fascination and compassion that it deserves. The person who presents with a new problem that is, in its essential emotional structure, the same problem they have presented with before. In a different relationship, a different context, a different set of externally visible circumstances, but carrying the same emotional signature, the same relational dynamic, the same fundamental question that was never answered the last time. The repetition is not accidental. It is the mind's most persistent attempt to find a resolution it has not yet been able to achieve. Freud called this the repetition compulsion, the tendency to recreate situations that resemble earlier unresolved experiences, not because the person enjoys them, but because the nervous system is, in some deep and not fully conscious way, still trying to find a different outcome. The person who grew up with an emotionally unavailable parent and who consistently partners with emotionally unavailable people is not making the same mistake repeatedly. They are, each time, attempting to work through the original relational problem in the closest analog situation they can construct. The hope, beneath the awareness, is that this time the unavailable person will become available, that the love will work the transformation that it failed to work the first time. Understanding the repetition does not instantly break it. The pattern has deep neural roots. It is activated faster than conscious thought, and the specific circumstances that activate it are often exactly the ones in which the capacity for reflective choice is most compromised. Because the emotional intensity of the pattern's activation narrows the cognitive field in exactly the way that the original situation narrowed it. The person in the middle of the repetition is experiencing something that, from the inside, feels exactly like the original situation. Because, to the nervous system that is running the pattern, it is. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott described what he called the antisocial tendency, the specific behavior of children who had experienced significant deprivation, who acted out in ways that seemed self-defeating, but that were, at a deeper level, searches for the original good object that had been lost. He argued that the antisocial act was not the abandonment of the search, but its continuation by other means. Applied to adult repetition patterns, the insight is consistent. The behavior that appears self-defeating is almost always the ongoing search for what was needed and not received. A search that will continue, in whatever form is available, until the need is genuinely met or genuinely mourned as unmet. The exit from the repetition requires two things. First, the recognition of the pattern, the capacity to step back from the emotional intensity of the current situation enough to ask whether this is familiar, whether the quality of this experience maps onto an earlier experience, whether what feels like a reaction to the present person is also, in part, a response to the historical person they are invoking. Second, the genuine completion of the unfinished business that the repetition is seeking to address, not through the current situation, which is not the original and cannot provide the original completion, but through the deliberate, supported engagement with the original material itself. The repetition is not punishment. It is the mind's most persistent and most creative attempt to find, somewhere in the landscape of the present, the resolution that the past did not provide. Honoring the intent of the repetition, acknowledging what it is looking for, providing what it needs through appropriate means, is more effective than fighting the pattern or judging the person who is caught in it. The pattern is the path. Following it honestly, with the support of whatever resources are available, leads to the original wound. And the original wound, genuinely addressed, is the only thing that actually resolves the repetition that it has been producing. Part 4. What genuinely resolving the past produces. There is a quality available on the other side of the genuine resolution of unfinished business that is difficult to describe to someone who has not experienced it. Not happiness, necessarily, though happiness often accompanies it. Not the absence of difficulty. The genuinely resolved person still encounters difficulty. A specific quality of freedom. The freedom of someone who is genuinely in the present rather than partly in the past. Who is responding to the actual people in their life rather than, in part, to the ghosts of earlier relationships. Whose choices are genuinely directed by current values rather than, in part, by the historical fears that the unresolved past installed. The researcher Dan McAdams, who developed narrative identity theory, describes the process of what he calls narrative repair, the reworking of the self-narrative to incorporate difficult experiences in a way that is honest, coherent, and growth-oriented. He found, across multiple studies, that people who had been able to tell the story of their difficult experiences in a way that acknowledged the difficulty, found meaning in it, and connected it to the person they had become, what he called a redemption narrative, showed significantly higher levels of well-being, generativity, and psychological maturity than people who had either avoided the story or remained stuck in its most painful form. The resolution of the past is not the denial of it. The person who pretends that the difficult history did not happen, or did not matter, or did not cost what it cost, that person has not resolved the past. They have suppressed it. And suppression is not resolution. It is the postponement of resolution at a significant ongoing physiological and psychological cost. The genuine resolution includes the full acknowledgement of what happened and what it cost, the genuine grief for what was lost, the genuine anger where anger is appropriate, and ultimately the development of a relationship to the experience that can hold it without being entirely defined by it. The concept of post-traumatic growth, documented by psychologists Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, describes the specific positive changes that can follow the genuine processing of significant adversity, not the silver lining that premature positivity imposes on suffering before it has been fully felt. The specific, hard-won development that emerges from the genuine engagement with difficult experience, the deepened relationships, the expanded sense of possibility, the clarified priorities, the specific empathy for others in difficulty that only the experience of one's own difficulty, genuinely processed, can produce. What genuinely resolving the past produces, in practical daily terms, is the experience of meeting the present on its own terms, the new relationship that is experienced as itself rather than as the repetition of the old one, the present achievement that is felt as real rather than filtered through the old story of insufficiency, the current kindness that is received without the old guardedness that assumed kindness always came with a price, the present difficulty that is engaged with the full resources of the current self, rather than the constricted resources of the historical self that the pattern was activating. This is not a final arrival. The past is long, and the resolution is not complete in a single insight or a single therapeutic session or the reading of any single book. It is the work of a life, the ongoing, patient, genuinely committed work of closing what has been left open, grieving what was never grieved, completing what was never completed, and building from the genuine material of the life that was actually lived rather than the life it should have been, the most honest and most fully inhabited version of the life that continues. Part 5. The practice of closing what is open. The practice of closing what is open is not a single technique. It is an orientation, a standing, deliberate willingness to turn toward the unresolved rather than continuing to move around it. To ask, in the moments of disproportionate reaction, of familiar emotional flavor, of the specific exhaustion of the repeated pattern, what is still open here? What has not been completed? What is the past trying to finish through the present, and what would the genuine completion actually require? The first practice is the pattern journal, the ongoing, honest record of the recurring emotional patterns and situations in one's life. Not the journal of daily events, but the journal of themes. The specific emotional quality that appears repeatedly. The specific kinds of relationship dynamics that keep arising. The specific triggers that produce reactions that feel larger than the current situation. The specific fears and the specific compensations. Over time, the pattern journal produces a clarity about the recurring themes that is impossible to maintain in the immediacy of the experiences themselves. A bird's-eye view of the repetitions that reveals their structure, and in revealing their structure, begins to make genuine choice about them possible. The second practice is the deliberate completion work, the specific practices of engaging the unfinished business directly. The unsent letter written and the response received inwardly. The empty chair dialogue conducted with the honesty that the actual conversation could not always contain. The ritual of genuine completion, the ceremony, however small and private, that marks the end of a chapter that has been running past its natural conclusion. The specific, deliberate engagement with the grief, the anger, the love, the gratitude, whatever emotional material the unfinished business holds in the forms available, however imperfect in the present moment. The psychologist Jack Kornfield, whose work integrates Buddhist psychology with Western therapeutic approaches, describes a practice he calls the completion practice. The deliberate, compassionate meeting of the incomplete experiences of the past with the full presence of the current, wiser, more resourced self. Not in order to change what happened, that is not possible, but to provide the completion that the experience always needed and that the younger self could not obtain in the circumstances it actually faced. The completion occurs in the present. Its effects are felt in the present. And it is, in Kornfield's clinical and personal experience, one of the most powerful practices available for the genuine resolution of the unfinished business that the past has left in the present. The third practice is the cultivation of the present tense, the deliberate, daily returning of attention to the actual current moment, to the specific people, specific relationships, specific opportunities and challenges that are genuinely here rather than the historical versions that the pattern is attempting to reconstruct. The mindfulness practice, in this context, is not an abstract exercise in stress reduction. It is the specific, targeted cultivation of the present tense orientation that the pattern's activation is systematically undermining. The person who is genuinely present to the current relationship is the person who can see it as it actually is rather than as the template predicts it will be. The past does not have to run the present forever. Its influence does not disappear entirely. The history is real. The patterns are real. The neural architecture that the past built is genuinely there. But the relationship to all of it can change. The history that was running invisibly can become visible. The patterns that were automatic can become choice. The unfinished business that was pressing for completion through every analogous present situation can find its genuine completion and release the present from the service of a need that was never supposed to be met there. What remains, when the past has been honestly engaged and the unfinished business genuinely closed, is the present fully itself, genuinely here, available for the life that is happening in it rather than perpetually crowded with the life that has already passed.